Thanks, Bill. You made me sound a bit more interesting than I really am, but I'm delighted to be here and very pleased to talk about my favourite subject, which is dugongs. And sometime I'd like to come back again, this is a hint, and talk about some of the environmental policy work that I've been doing for the federal government, because some of it's pretty interesting. I've discovered that a lot of what the federal government does is plant blind. So I'm not a botanist, but I'm being converted. So Susan and co, sometime I'd like to come and talk to you about plant blindness. But today I'm not talking about that. I'm going to talk about the interactions between the dugong's environment and its behavioural ecology. I appreciate that wasn't the advertised title, but it's close, and I changed my mind as I developed the talk, which is very characteristic of me. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and the land of all the people who might be listening online, and I'd particularly like to acknowledge the fact that dugongs are an animal of great cultural significance, not only to Indigenous people in Australia, but actually to Indigenous people in the 40 plus countries in their range throughout the world. So why have they been so important from a cultural point of view? Well, they're very nice to eat, so that's part of the story, but it's a bit more than that, and they are supposed to be the origin of the mermaid legend, although if you go into the origins of the mermaid legend, you can find that actually there are lots of origins of the mermaid legend, but that's one of them. I reckon you'd need to have been at sea for a fairly long time before you made that connection. I'll let you into a secret. I think it's more about lust than likeness. And dugongs have been used as surrogate females by sailors all over the world. And in fact, in Tanzania, even in the 1970s, if a fisherman caught a dugong in his net, he had to sign a form for the government to say he hadn't interfered with it. So that's a little known fact about the mermaid legend. So the recent Sirenians or sea cows, of which dugongs are one of 5 species, occur in tropical and subtropical coastal waters and rivers right across the tropics and subtropics, except for Stella's sea cow, which occurred in much colder water in the North Pacific. So we have Stella's sea cow, which was the largest of the modern marine mammals, except the great whales. And it occurred on this huge range from Mexico across round to Japan. The dugong has an absolutely huge range from East Africa across to the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, between the latitudes of about Brisbane, north and south of the equator. And the 3 species of manatees are Atlantic, 2 species on the Caribbean coast and in the Amazon, and the West African manatee on the other side of the Atlantic. So one of the things that's very puzzling to biologists is how did Stella's sea cow manage to cope with cold water? Well, it was a lot bigger, and that's helpful with the surface area volume ratio. But in last year, a really interesting paper was published that indicated it was a bit more than that. So here, just so that to introduce you to these animals, these are skeletons from the Smithsonian, and this is an actual skeleton, or it's a composite skeleton if you really want to know, of Stella's sea cow. It's not a fossil. It was became extinct in the 18th century. And there's a dugong, which you can see is quite gracile in comparison. and a Florida manatee. A couple of things I want you to notice, the difference in size, but also if you look at the skull, you can see the Steller sea cow actually had no teeth and ate algae and had a fairly horizontally open mouth. The manatee also had a much more horizontally open mouth than a dugong. You can't see it in this picture, but it has complicated teeth, very like other mammalian herbivores. And here's the dugong. It has tusks. This is an adult male, and its mouth opens ventrally, which means it's an obligate bottom feeder. That's a very important part of the story that I'm going to tell you today. But let's go back to Steller's sea cow and imagine how it has coped with cold water. And last year there was a paper published which said, actually, they looked at skin, because the major museums of the world have skeleton skulls and skin of these animals because they were made extinct relatively recently. And they found that the lipooxygenase genes are inactive, and in humans that causes a skin disease characteristic by a very thick hyperkeratopic epidermis, very, very thick. Now, I asked the question, this may have helped Steller's sea cow cope with cold water, but did it mean that it lost the sensory hairs that are so important to all the other sirenians? I think it did. So they're called sea cows. Some people think they should be called sea elephants because they've got a trunk. And actually, genetically, they're much closer to elephants than any other terrestrial mammal. Or could they be called marine naked mole rats? Because 25% of their total cortical area is what's called somatosensory, which means that their most important senses are touch and hydrodynamic reception. So the work that's been done on manatees suggests that these mammals have what is the closest thing to a mammalian lateral line. So if you look, you can see that these red areas and the dotted red areas are 25% of their sensory capability. Hearing's pretty important, but vision's not very important at all. If you look here on the head, and we can't see the other side, but you can see there are highly developed hairs all over this, much more developed than the rest of the body, and here, and this is their most important sense. It's like they've got cat's whiskers all over their bodies, and there are fine hairs everywhere. So this is the most important way in which these very strange mammals get information about their environment. So here, vision, the eyes are very small. They mainly occur in very turbid waters. This photograph here, these are remora fish. Fish around because they're digging up seagrass. And this is in Egypt where the water is very clear. But those of you who will be familiar with the waters around here or around Townsville or generally in the GBR, most of the waters in which they occur are very turbid indeed, and vision is much less important. Hearing, that's the ear hole, it is important, and Indigenous people certainly know that and take that into account. But the most important sense is what they learn from their sensory hairs, and that's probably how they find food. Rob Coles was asking me today, can they smell? Probably not. Can they taste? Yes, they do have a sense of taste and they have taste buds, but this is the hairs are super important. Now, all the extant sirenians are primarily plant eaters, but actually closet omnivores, a little known secret. and they live in warm water habitats which are accessible to people, which is probably a bad idea. So if you look at the Amazonian manatee, it's only in freshwater. The other manatees have can live in riverine and shallow water marine habitats. But the dugong is strictly marine. It doesn't need to drink. It gets all the water it wants from its food. And it mainly lives in fairly shallow waters, but dugong feeding trails have been found down to about 35 metres. So we don't really know how important those deep water seagrass beds are. I think they are quite important in parts of Torres Strait, probably not often as far deep as this, but it's certainly a very different environment to the environment that even manatees live in, because where they live in the marine environment, it's very shallow indeed. Now, because they have this mouth that opens ventrally, they're obligate bottom feeders. If you ever watch a dugong in an aquarium trying to feed on the surface, it looks clumsy and pathetic. It can't do it. Now, this is a dugong skull in the head, and gives you the idea of how that quite amazing skull works. This is actually a longitudinal section of a dugong head. I once took a frozen dugong head to the local butcher. It was a long time ago, before I think people were obsessed with, health restrictions. I'm sure they wouldn't do it now. And they used a bandsaw to go down the middle. A couple of things I want to show you. You can see what an extraordinary mouth, and how actually it has to feed on the bottom. You can see that the teeth are pretty degenerate. And Janet Lanyon, who's a student of mine, thought that they probably weren't very important at all. That's very contentious. But they have these horny pads which act as a conveyor belt to take seagrass up into the gut. This sort of feeding apparatus means that there is some evidence that dugongs cope much better with low fibre seagrasses than much more developed seagrasses. Again, contentious, because there's been a dugong in captivity in Japan for more than 30 years, and it has only ever been fed very robust seagrasses. So a dugong is what I call a seagrass community specialist, because it uses two feeding modes to eat around 30 kilos, 40 kilos, depending on the size of the animal, of seagrass per day. That is a lot of seagrass, particularly when you have low biomass seagrasses like this. So in some places, the seagrass is growing in like a bush. This is in Shark Bay in Western Australia, and dugongs can't dig up bushes. And actually they can't dig up seagrass like thalassia on the top of reefs where there's a very pavement, a very hard sediment. But in soft sediments like this, they dig up whole plants, leaving feeding trails. And in some places, they also eat algae. Some places, they only eat algae. Tony Preen, another student of mine, said they are closet carnivores, and they certainly eat burrowing invertebrates, worms, ascidians, mussels, soft shelled small mussels, etc., in winter at the high level latitude limits to their range. Do they do that off cans? I don't know. There is no evidence. As largely herbivores, they're likely to be short of nitrogen, and in winter, at the high level latitudes, they're probably very short of nitrogen, which is probably where they supplement their diet. They may not have to do that up here. It's question mark about that, because although the seagrass does grow seasonally, it's less seasonal than further south. So a dugong having to eat so much has a life of diving and surfacing. And this is some very exciting work that's being done by a current PhD student. If you've got any questions, I think she's online, Renee Lambourne, and she is putting amazing multi-dimensional sensors on dugongs. They're connected with suction cups and a galvanic time release, which means it comes off after a few days because she has to get them back. And this is providing very interesting three-dimensional details of diving behaviour. So if you look at two-dimensional diving behaviour from time depth recorders, you're not seeing anything particularly interesting. It's often very hard to interpret because they're working in shallow water mainly, and time depth recorders are really designed for deep diving animals like elephant seals. But with these accelerometers, you can see the difference between this dive, which is likely a feeding dive here. It's gone, the animals has gone down quickly and come up quickly, and a dive like this one where the animals is coming down much more slowly, staying very little time at the bottom and then coming up much more slowly. I believe that Renee's work is going to give us amazing insights into how much time dugongs really spend feeding and sleeping, because at the moment there's a lot of guessing about that. And also it's going to give us important information on where in the water column they reach neutral buoyancy, and that's probably the water depth at which they go on long swims, which I'll tell you about now. So we learned a lot about dugong movements from satellite tracking, and this started in the early 90s. I think I published the first paper then, and has gone from strength to strength since then, but has actually always given rather puzzling results. One of my other students divided dugongs into hoons and homebodies. The hoons were animals that went around and went on long distance trips, and the homebodies did nothing much and worked in local areas going in and out of the tides. The first two animals that we tagged in Cleveland Bay near Townsville, one was a hoon and one was a homebody. So the homebody was probably the most boring dugong ever. It sat at the mouth of Alligator Creek in eastern Cleveland Bay, went in and out with the tides for 15 months. And the hoon went from Cleveland Bay to Upstart Bay 3 times in 6 weeks, after which his satellite tag came off. Animals had gone on, some animals, remarkable trips. So this is an animal that was caught in around Hinchinbrook. It went more than 500 kilometres up to Princess Charlotte Bay. It was accompanied by a calf, and it came back again. It went to Hinchinbrook, and then it went on to Townsville. Other animals have gone from Borroloola in the Northern Territory to Mornington Island. Quite extraordinary. What's the difference between a hoon and a homebody? We don't know, because there's been no obvious gender difference. We do know that some of the hoons have calves, which we think the mothers teach the calves a lot, because there's a long period of calf dependency. Whether every homebody turns into a hoon, if you could only track it for long enough, we don't know, because there are very few animals that have been tracked for long periods because the tracking devices come off. They're designed to do that, but they come off more often than we want. So this is a situation in Moreton Bay near Brisbane. Now, Moreton Bay has quite a large dugong population on these banks in the Eastern Bay. In the winter, the water temperature outside the bay is a few degrees warmer, and animals go on these trips in and out of South Passage. Different colours of different animals. Some of the animals don't go out at all. Others go out multiple times, particularly if it's cold winter, and they're very clever, they go out with the tides during the day and they will come in so they can feed at high tide on those banks at night. And they always go out with the high tide and come in with the in tide, and actually the tide goes quite fast there, so they're using very little energy. They're only staying out of the bay for about 6 hours. We've done the sums, and that can make quite a big difference to how much heat they're losing from their bodies, even a few degrees. Oh, sorry. So the movements are mostly related to coastal features. Now, again, this is based on frustratingly small sample sizes, because when animals are moving fast, you don't get very good tracks, even with modern equipment, although it's getting much better. So here we've got an animal going from Moreton Bay up to outside Great Fraser Island, Gari now called, right along the coast, and coming back the same way. That's a bit of a career limiting move, because there are shark nets along the coast in the Rainbow Beach area, and they're still there, and they occasionally catch animals, because the animals are moving through at just the wrong place. I would expect that the animals are using that hydrodynamic reception very effectively to be in the right place in terms of currents and waves, etc. Here, this is from Chris Klager's work in New Caledonia, and published in a recent review. And this is an animal going right along the edge of a fringing reef in New Caledonia, and it's using the reef like a road. This is another place where animals come out and sit in the warm water just off this place here in winter, and for hours at a time. And again, the water temperature difference is only a few degrees, but again, we've done the sums, and it makes quite a difference to heat loss. But these movements are not reflected in the genetics, and the genetics suggest that there are cryptic barriers to gene flow that we really don't understand. Now, if you look at dugong genetics at a global scale, it's relatively easy to come up with a very convincing story based on sea level rise and the situation at times of glacial maxima. But it's more puzzling along the coast. So this is work done by Alexandra McGowan, and actually her primary advisor was Jenny Seddon, who's the new DVCR at JCU, and I was involved to a limited extent. But this is using microsatellites, and you can see this is quite a good sample size of animals north and south of Midge Point, which is in the middle of the Whitsundays. And the same pattern is showing up using SNPs. Why would there be such a huge genetic break, a deep break at this point? Well, the currents around the Whitsundays are very complicated. There's certainly seagrass around there. Eric Wolanski's view is that the currents are very different there than other places on the coast, and that this may be a reason, because again, we're talking about animals that are hydrodynamic sensors, and that they choose, and that's the cause of the genetic break. There's certainly no other physical barrier that's obvious. Another thing to think about is there are deep water seagrass beds off here and somewhere further south, and there's a break there. Are the animals going in and out to those beds? We simply don't know. So there's a lot more structure than would be indicated by the movements. obviously what's happening is animals are not moving and breeding. So, for example, there's quite a lot of difference in genetic structure between Moreton Bay and Hervey Bay, but we know the dugongs frequently move between those two areas. So this is going back to, I guess, the earliest work I did on dugongs a long time ago. And in those days, dugong biology was fisheries biology, and we studied dead ones because with the technology wasn't available to study live ones like it is today. So this is what I did was I learned how to determine their age using growth rings in their tusks. This animal was 32 years old when she died, and I could show that one dark line and plus one light line equaled 1 year's growth. The tusks actually don't look like this if you cut them on a bandsaw, but you treat them so that they end up looking like this. We also could see whether animals had calved or not, or were reproductively active by looking at their reproductive organs. And so you can put all that together and work out that dugongs can live for more than 70 years. Females have their first calf between 7 and 15 years. That variation is very important. I'll tell you about that in a minute. They have one calf at a time. They occasionally can have twins at intervals of 3 to 7 years. Again, very variable, very important. The calf nurses for 18 to 24 months and spends that time learning stuff from their mum, probably largely by going on trips and learning about the environment. The male sexual maturity is also quite wide range. The males are discontinuous breeders. So that means that at any one time, there will be some mature males in the population that are breeding and some are not. That has been confirmed by more modern work on the hormones, which is giving exactly the same results as I got from the carcass analysis. And why would that be the case? Because lots of mammals are seasonal breeders, right? But these are discontinuous breeders and it's not synchronised. So why would this be so? Well, we think that being a reproductively active male is very demanding. The males are into pack rape, actually, and in these breeding herds, in most parts of their range, there is some evidence of a slightly different breeding strategy, which is a bit questionable in one place. But this is the typical situation. Actually, you know, that sort of fighting with those tusks and that sort of very active mating is very exhausting. So we think that the males come in and out of active breeding, and in the tropics, there is not a really marked breeding season. So there are reproductively active males in a population at any one time, always at any one time, but not all the mature males are reproductively active. Now, with this sort of life history strategy, adult survivorship has to be very, very high to maintain a population. And you can do the modelling and the sums, and basically, if there's 100 dugongs out there, you know, in Cleveland Bay, there's near Townsville a few hundred. Actually, the sustainable human caused mortality per year is very low, but if there were 10,000 dugongs, yes, you can maintain a harvest. Now, in a place like Torres Strait, which is the dugong capital of the world, actually there are tens of thousands of dugongs, and they have maintained quite a significant harvest for thousands of years, 6,000 years at least. And here's a dugong mound, Ian McNiven and his students. This is on Mobiag, and they found remains of between 10,000 and 11,000 dugongs caught in the 400 years before European settlement. So there's evidence of this going back 6,000 years. If you have a very large population, it can sustain a fishery, but most dugong populations in the world are small because in most places the area of seagrass is quite small, and I'm currently doing a overarching review of the situation of dugongs across the world for UNEP, and in most places there are only fairly local, smallish seagrass beds supporting at most hundreds of dugongs, and the minute you start having a major dugong fishery, which has happened in places like the Nancy Shoto Islands, south of Japan, many times, the population plummets very quickly. So the only long-term social unit that we know about is the cow and the calf. Although you can have herds of dugongs, focal follows have shown that animals are only with other animals for very short times, except for the cow and the calf. So they stay together, as I said, for the calf suckles its mum for at least 18 months or 2 years, but they can stay together longer than that. The calf can get a free load right on the mother's back, and the evidence, particularly from Florida manatees, would indicate that the cows learn a huge amount from the calf. The calves learn a huge amount from the cows, particularly about places to go when the seagrass dies back, because the seagrass is a very dynamic environment. So this means that dugongs are not wilderness animals. This is a photo taken by Len Mackenzie in Johor Strait between Singapore and Malaysia, one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. Here are the dugong feeding trails in the shallows on the Malaysian side, and I've flown that area. There are quite a few dugongs, and they come in from reefs on the eastern side of Malaysia, and they come into these areas to feed. You would think that was a career-limiting move, and it probably is, but they come. Similarly, near in Gladstone, here's the coal loader, and here are people from the JCU seagrass team looking at seagrasses, and there are dugong feeding trails all through there. Sometimes people report seeing a dugong feeding from the sea bar in Townsville. I have never seen that, but I've heard about it lots of times, and Rob has too. But because dugongs are mammals, they eat a lot of seagrass. If seagrass dies back, they can suffer recruitment failure. They can all suffer mortality as well. So in the 1970s, there's a lot of anecdotal information in the literature of massive seagrass diebacks in Torres Strait. I think there's some evidence that some of that's happened again recently. Nobody knows why, unless Alex does, about what's happening now. You can ask her. Anyway, I inherited a lot. I told you early dugong work was all on dead animals, and of samples from dugongs in the Daru market, which is just on the PNG side of Torres Strait, sort of up there. Torres Strait's the dugong capital of the world. You can see this is aerial surveys for the whole of Queensland, and you can just see how important Torres Strait is relative to anywhere else. And in the mid-90s, in the mid-70s, coincident with the seagrass dieback, actually none of the females that were coming in to the Daru market, these are mature animals, were pregnant. And then as the seagrass recovered, the proportion pregnant increased. So about 20 years later, Donna Kwan, who is a former student of mine, actually was studying dugongs that were being caught by hunters at Mobiag, which is that place with the huge dugong middens. And Donna came, and she was aging them, and she came to me and she said, this is the strangest age frequency curve. Now, this end of the curve makes sense because the younger animals were not being hunted. They're coming into the fisheries, they get older. We would expect a curve to go down like that, and there's this big gap. And Donna said, what could it be? And I said, I know straight away, Donna, there was recruitment failure 20 years ago in Torres Strait when the seagrass died back. And that pattern has showed up subsequently again and again. So in the 1992, there were 2 floods and a cyclone in Hervey Bay, which is the most important dugong area on the east coast, south of Cape York, and 1,000 square kilometres of seagrass habitat was lost. There were at least 99 dugong carcasses recovered. Some of them were recovered because they got stuck in the East Australian current down south of Sydney. The proportion of calves in aerial surveys declined from 22%, which is very high actually, in 88 to 2.2% in 93. And there were similar loss of seagrass in 2023. Michael and his team have gone and looked. Chris Klager did an aerial survey. Actually, a lot of animals had clearly left Hervey Bay, and the animals that were left were mainly in the central area where at the time of the aerial survey, should have been 22, sorry, was the only seagrass left. Michael tells me the seagrass is coming back. I would expect the dugongs to come back. Some certainly died, but most of them didn't. There was also mortality associated with seagrass loss in the summer of 2010-2011 when we had Cyclone Yasi and massive floods along the coast, and the seagrass, big seagrass diebacks. Record number of dead dugongs found in the Queensland Strandnet program, and when there was an aerial survey at the end of that year, there were no calves sighted. Many of those animals, it would be that the females were starving and they could no longer nurse their calves. And after that time, there was also temporary emigration from the urban coast, and key areas like Hinchinbrook and Townsville and Upstart Bay, there were far fewer animals recorded then than had been a few years earlier. When the area was resurveyed a few years later, actually most of the animals had come back. So quite a lot had died, but obviously many had emigrated. In Hervey Bay, the same sort of thing has happened, and in 2022, Chris found far fewer animals than in the previous survey in 2016. Now, some of that will be due to death, but most of it will be due to emigration. And my tip was when the seagrass comes back, and Michael tells me it is, that the dugongs will gradually return. Extreme weather can also cause mass strandings. So in the early 80s, there was Cyclone Kathy across the Gulf of Carpentaria coast, and there were hundreds of turtles and tens of dugongs stranded up to 9 kilometres inland. My goodness, it's scary to think of what a storm surge can do, and behind stands of mangroves up to 3 metres tall. Anyway, when we went there, that's a much younger Helene, we found these animals in pools, still alive, in the mud. Actually, they'd been very lucky. It had rained for the next week, and I told you, dugongs are somasensory animals. When they hit a net or they hit anything, they spin, and they spun in the supertidal mudflats and stayed alive. Once it stopped raining, and which is like it was when we got there. Actually, the animals didn't last very long, but they had lasted a week. We've also seen habitat loss due to seagrass dieback from marine heat waves. So in Shark Bay in 2011, particularly the amphibolus, the bushes, died. And they went from this to this, and that caused the loss of more than 1,000 square kilometres of seagrass. The dugongs again stopped breeding, but there is no evidence of dugong death or emigration. It's a pretty remote area, so we can't be sure there weren't deaths, but there were no reports. But actually, although if you're a seagrass lover, that's very tragic, but in Shark Bay, there are also other seagrasses that dugongs like a lot more than they like amphibolus, and the fast-growing ones. And actually, the dugongs still had something to eat, unlike the situation on the East Coast. And the recovery meant that the lower seral stages that dugongs like came back quicker than the amphibolus. So although, you know, when you read about it, it was a terrible tragedy, it was possibly not a terrible tragedy for dugongs. So Kath Collier's work suggests that climate change could lead to a reduction in the deep water seagrass habitats, that higher water temperatures increase seagrass light requirements, and in very turbid water that could limit seagrasses. So if Kath is right, and I understand this is a bit contentious, thermal stress could cause contraction in deep water seagrass beds. Now, in many areas, that's not going to matter, I don't think, but in Western Torres Strait, there are quite significant, these are dugong densities from aerial surveys, and this is seagrass. Mainly in the deeper water here, the dugongs are not occurring much in water after about 25 metres, and then much more in the shallower waters. This is the seagrass from the seagrass group here. So will that mean that there is loss of deep water seagrass and animals moving into shallow water where they're much more at risk from human disturbance? I don't know. But in most areas, I'd say that this use of deep water is not as important as in Torres Strait. So if we think about the impacts of extreme weather events on dugongs, cyclones and floods certainly cause mortality, temporary emigration, reduced fecundity, and occasionally mass strandings. Marine heat waves can cause seagrass death and certainly reduce fecundity in dugongs. Of course, all of these things weather events coexist with the existing impacts on dugongs, and something's being done in the GDR about gill netting. These are animals off Cairns, actually. And so gill netting will be abolished in the GBR by the end of 27, which I think is a good thing. I'd like to say that Indigenous people have been very respectful in the GBR of the impacts of extreme weather events and curtailed hunting. We have an issue of vessel strikes, not like manatees, but there's still a problem. And of course, coastal development and the issue about water quality reducing seagrass. If we look at the status of dugongs from the State of the Environment report, we can see that there's lots of places, the yellow, where actually we've got a baseline, but we haven't got a trend. There are places where the situation looks okay. The southern GBR, and by that I mean from Cooktown South, is the only place where we have documented evidence of a decline, and Chris Klager's work at the end of last year actually amplified that. And of course, he also found a decline in Hervey Bay, which had looked very good until that point. Now, whether that decline persists when the seagrass comes back, I don't know. I think the jury is out. But it's a very uneven picture. So my conclusions are that climate stresses are already affecting the coastal habitats of dugongs. We know that when they occur, there can be changes to their demography, movements, and habitat use. The impacts can be locally variable but widespread, and temporary movements between seagrass beds are very, very important. So we need a lot of places for animals to move when there's local scale losses. Increased recruitment failure and mortality could be widespread if we get a succession of extreme weather events. And lastly, I'd like to leave you with this image, which is a good luck charm that I photographed at the British Museum. It was never on display, and it was taken on dugong hunts by hunters in Torres Strait to bring them luck. I think a lot about what happens to dugongs and their interactions with seagrass is luck, because we live in such a dynamic environment. When I looked at these animals, and there were a number of them, I looked and I could see that actually all of them were pregnant females. If you're a dugong specialist, you can tell that from the carving. The people at the British Museum said no one had ever told them that before. So I put it here because I hope that dugongs have some luck in the future, because if we have successions of extreme weather events close together, they're certainly going to need it. Thank you.